right, welcome back to Morning Live. Now, as you may all know that the month of May is Africa Month. It's been 60 years after colonialism and a lot has happened to change the face of the African continent. Governments have risen and fallen and the history has been rewritten. This morning we're taking stock of what has happened since, and we look at the progress that has been made on issues such as leadership and development, and of course the narrative of Africa as an economy to contend with it. We're joined in our studios in Johannesburg by Dr. Richard Iroanya, who is an independent political analyst. Dr. Iroanya, good morning to you and thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, let's just go back a little to the Millennium Development Goals, of course, whose deadline was back in 2015. How has Africa done in that regard?
Oh, well, just like you pointed out earlier on in our discussion, that progress have been made in certain areas and the failures have been also encountered in other areas. The development Millennium Goal in the first place, we asked ourselves, was it really necessary for Africa? Why do we have the Millennium Development Goal? I think in the 1980s we had what we call the African Lagos Plan of Action, which was a development strategy for the African continent, and that was abandoned. And all of a sudden, we came up with it was abandoned for structural adjustment program of the global financial institutions, and now we came up with this idea of a Millennium Development Goal. Okay, a lot of goals were set, to be achieved. And according to the report by the UN, progress was made in many of those goals in different countries. But collectively, a lot of progress was achieved, but not in Africa, because the Millennium Development Goals in Africa were never achieved. And that's because the institutions are not in place, or if they are in place, they are not functioning as supposed. And there are a lot of other problems that Africa should tackle. A Millennium Development Goal was meant for countries that we are already on a certain level of development and who have the resources and institutions, to realize those goals. But those resources were in fact lacking in Africa, and that was part of the reason why Africa could not achieve on the Millennium Development Goals.
All right, but in terms of education is one of the challenges, particularly for girl children in this African continent. What improvements or strides have been made in terms of education in the African continent?
Oh, I think it depends on the region, the countries from which you are looking at it. If I take, for instance, the West African, in a sub-region, girl education has actually, increased or improved. But now, when you take a country like Nigeria, for example, we have the Boko Haram, security situation in northern Nigeria that has set whatever achievement that has been made in that regard backward. And so we have other problems militating against girls' education in Nigeria and other African countries, also issues of religion, issues of culture, and we need to tackle these issues if we are serious about educating the girl child. And I think also that the enrollment, in school, in primary school education and high school education, for the girls actually, increased. But we are also not talking about the numbers. We're also talking about the quality of education that we are offering to our generation. It is not about certification that is important, but acquiring the necessary knowledge and skills to make sure that these girls and of course our future generation, can actually make use of what they have acquired, to live independent life, to live be economically beneficial, not only to their family, to themselves, but also to the country and region.
Now, we are reporting this morning, in fact, over the weekend, that about 270 girls that were
abducted
by Boko Haram in Nigeria were released this past weekend. What do you make of the situation?
Well, I think it's a good news, at least for the families of those girls that have been, kidnapped. But then it talk about the future that what they have lost. And some have come out, limping, walking on crutches. Some have come back pregnant. Some have come back with children. Their future, to a certain extent, is destroyed. It takes a lot, for the country to rebuild them, or for them to rebuild themselves, and they need state support. At this stage. But I don't know to what extent the Nigerian government is prepared to offer that to the families and to the children in particular.
A quick one on this one, Doctor. What's your view on the African Union as a body? Has there been any change or significant changes ever since its days as the OAU?
Well, the name has changed from OAU to the African Union. That's a change in itself. But then when you look at the operation, it is still a gathering of African, a club of African heads of states. It's still much about talks and without actions. But then there have been some, kind of progress. We have democracy now, and many of the African countries, unlike what we had in the past, we had military coups and counter-coup dictatorships, and still democracies, in the 1980s. These are beginning to change, in some areas, like in Nigeria, where a sitting president could lead the election and still concede the fate. It was unheard of. I think progress was made in certain areas, and thanks to people like the former president of South Africa who played a significant role in this, and other leaders, African Renaissance, and the march towards the march towards Agenda 2063. There have been some kind of achievement. Security-wise, the AU has deployed forces, to make sure that we silence the guns by 2030. There have been some significant changes, and we hope that we can sustain this. And going forward,
Okay, so at some stage we do know that Africa was plagued by coups, but it looks like things are getting a little better.
Yes, because it is now internationally condemned, for the military to take over undemocratically, take over power from democratically elected leaders. The pressure, international pressure, has been mounted on countries, and of course the reactivation of the African civil society, which have become vibrant in recent times, I think beginning from the 1990s, also contributed to this awareness and the rejection of undemocratic coups and counter-coups that are happening.
And the type of leadership that we have in the continent.
Well, in some area, there are some success stories that can be cited anyway. But then African leaders will still have the problem of corruption. It's a major challenge on the African continent. We still have the issues of poverty, enough widespread poverty, in Africa. We've not been able to provide effective leadership to tackle these challenges and to make sure that Africa can reap the benefits of the 21st century.
And of course, many not wanting to seize power
when
it's time to step down.
Exactly. Right. You have government who have remained in powers and until they died, So,
Dr. Iroanya, we'll leave it at that. There are so many issues to look into, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much indeed. There you have it. Dr. Richard Iroanya is an independent political analyst, and we're talking about a whole lot of things as we are celebrating Africa Month here in the continent.